pulled my beat-up truck up to the main gate of Fort Monroe, the late afternoon sun already dipping low over the Chesapeake Bay. The light hit the old brick buildings just right, making them look kind of majestic, not like they were empty and forgotten. David had told me it was an easy gig, just watching screens and driving around, nothing to it. He said it was easy money, a good way to stack some cash after leaving the army. What he didn't mention was the part about it being a ghost town. I mean, I knew it was decommissioned, but this whole place felt like it had been deserted for decades. I got out of my truck and stretched, trying to work out the kinks from the drive. The air felt thick, almost heavy, like a really big storm was about to hit, even though the sky was wide open and clear. Not a cloud anywhere. It was just a strange feeling, a kind of quiet that felt too deep for a place this big. I walked over to the security office, a small, square building tucked away near the old parade grounds. The door creaked when I opened it, revealing a cramped room that smelled stale, like dust and old electronics. Inside, the light was dim, all fluorescent tubes that buzzed quietly. There were a bunch of monitors lining one wall, most of them showing static or grainy, unmoving shots of overgrown lawns and empty roads. A desk sat in the middle of the room, piled high with old logbooks and a scattered mess of papers. And next to all that, an ancient-looking radio setup, all dials and big, chunky buttons. It looked like it belonged in a museum, not a working security office. No wonder David thought it was easy money. This place practically ran itself, mostly because there was nothing left to really guard. I checked the time on my phone. Almost 5. My first night shift at Fort Monroe was about to kick off. I walked over to the desk, pulled out the worn chair, and settled in. The springs groaned under my weight. I looked through the logbook, flipping past pages filled with sparse entries. 2100 perimeter check clear, 300 no activity. Nothing exciting, just what I expected. David was right. It was easy money. Hours passed slowly. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. No traffic sounds, no distant sirens, just the hum of the old equipment and the occasional groan from the building settling. I spent most of the time getting familiar with the camera feeds, trying to figure out which blurry patch was what. Most of the cameras were fixed, pointing at the same empty stretches of tarmac or the dark windows of the barracks. Every now and then, a gust of wind would make a tree branch sway, but that was about it for activity. Around 10 o'clock, I was halfway through a cold cup of coffee, staring at a monitor that showed a deserted training field. That's when it happened. A faint crackle came from one of the radio sets, the big, old one that looked like it had been around since the base opened. I probably wouldn't have even noticed it if the room hadn't been so quiet. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft hiss, then something else, buried under the static. Whispering. I leaned closer, trying to really hear it. It wasn't clear, not like someone talking on a walkie-talkie. It was just a low murmur, like voices talking really, really quietly, or maybe a bunch of people talking all at once, but from far away. I figured it was interference, maybe a signal from nearby Norfolk, or just the old equipment acting up. I reached for the radio, grabbing one of the big, smooth dials. It felt cool under my fingers. I tried to adjust the frequency anyway, twisting the dial slowly. The whispering continued, just on the edge of understanding. I couldn't make out any actual words, no matter how hard I listened or how much I messed with the dial. It was just this disembodied, unreadable sound, like a secret conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I pulled my hand back from the radio. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the broken AC, a fact I'd been well aware of since I started. This was different, a strange kind of cold that seemed to settle in my bones. My neck felt prickly, the hairs there standing up. I tried to tell myself it was just a technical glitch, one of those weird things that happens with old gear. Fort Monroe was full of this stuff. Things probably shorted out, or wires were crossed. That had to be it. I looked at the radio again, the small light on its display glowing a faint green. The whispering hadn't stopped, even after I let go of the dial. It was still there, a constant, low buzz under the static. I took another sip of my awful coffee, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just equipment. Old, tired equipment, playing tricks in a lonely, quiet place. But the chill stayed with me, no matter how much I tried to brush it off. The chill I'd felt the other night had stuck with me, a quiet kind of uneasiness that kept me on edge even when I was off duty. I tried to chalk it up to a long day, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me in a deserted place like Fort Monroe. I mean, it was spooky, right? All those empty buildings, that heavy quiet. But a few nights later, the feeling hadn't gone away. It had gotten worse. I was deep into my shift, driving my beat-up pickup truck around the perimeter of the base. The big, clunky thing rattled and groaned with every bump in the road, the headlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. The air was thick and still, like it was holding its breath. I kept the window cracked, just a little, letting in the cool night air that smelled like salt and decay. It was part of my routine now, doing these rounds, trying to make the time pass. The whispers had picked up. They weren't just on the radio in the security office anymore. That old setup, with its glowing green light, seemed to hum with them every time I stepped foot in the room. But now, it was like they were traveling with me. My handheld radio, the dinky little walkie-talkie I carried for backup, started to pick them up too. It was faint at first, barely there, just a hiss of static with something underneath it. A low murmur, always just on the edge of audibility, like a conversation happening just out of reach. I tried to mess with the handheld, twisting the antenna, tapping the side, even smacking it against my palm once or twice. It didn't do any good. The whispers just kept coming, getting a little clearer, then fading back into the hiss. It was the same sound, too. That disembodied, unreadable murmur, like a crowd of people talking at once, but far away. I found myself cranking up the truck's radio, anything to drown out the sound, to fill the silence with something else. It was usually just crackly pop music, but it was better than the whispers. I drove past the old firing range, a wide, flat expanse of overgrown grass, with a few rusted targets still standing sentry in the distance. The wind picked up then, rattling the tall, dry weeds. The whispers on my handheld seemed to intensify, cutting through the static on the truck radio like a knife. It was like they were right there, just outside the truck, talking just to me. I slowed down, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I told myself it was the wind, the old radio acting up, but it felt more personal now, more direct. The motor pool was next, a grid of deserted bays where military vehicles used to get serviced. Now, it was just empty concrete and a few sagging structures. I pulled up to one of the open bays, cutting the engine. The sudden silence in the truck was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the base's power lines. The whispers on my handheld were almost clear now, a low chatter that sounded mournful. I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't just turn the radio off. What if something real happened? What if it was a real emergency? I couldn't risk it. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, watching the shadows dance in the empty bays. The air felt colder in this secluded spot, a deep, penetrating chill that seeped into my bones. It was the kind of cold that seemed to come from inside the ground itself. The handheld radio crackled, and suddenly, the murmurs became a chorus, louder than before. It was like an echo of countless voices, all blending into one. I could almost make out words, fragments, phrases that dissolved before I could grasp them. My neck felt prickly, the hairs standing up again. I pressed the transmit button on the handheld, just to break the spell. The sudden squawk of static from my end was loud enough to make me jump. I let go of the button, my palm feeling sweaty. I looked at the dark recesses of the motor pool, imagining things in the shadows, shapes that weren't there. I wished I could just drive away and leave this place, but I had a job to do. My rounds took me past the old barracks, rows of identical brick buildings with dark, empty windows. Each one looked like a set of vacant eyes staring out into the night. They felt even more unsettling than the other buildings, like they were waiting for someone to come back. I usually just drove by them, doing a quick scan. But tonight, something made me slow down again. I pulled up to one of the barracks, the truck's tires crunching on the loose gravel. I cut the engine, the sudden quiet making the handheld radio even more prominent. The whispers were loud now, a swirling, desperate sound that almost swallowed the static. And then, cutting through it all, a distinct phrase. Not a murmur this time, not muffled, clear as day. Find us. The words hung in the air, a cold, sharp blade. It wasn't just interference. It felt like a voice, strained and full of urgency. Right after that, a burst of static exploded from the radio, so loud it made me jump, my hands flying to my ears for a second. My whole body tensed up, shoulders hunched. I slammed a hand against the side of the truck, trying to calm myself. It was too loud for an old radio, too clear for static. This wasn't some minor glitch with the equipment. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, trying to get my bearings. The radio went back to its usual whispery static, the loud burst gone. But the words, "Find us," echoed in my head. I had to report this. I couldn't just pretend I hadn't heard it. This was beyond odd, beyond anything I'd signed up for. The base was supposed to be empty, desolate, but it felt like I wasn't alone. I picked up my phone, my fingers fumbling a bit, and dialed Kevin's number. Kevin Rodriguez was my supervisor, a guy who sounded perpetually annoyed on the phone, even at 2 in the morning. He was usually just a voice on the other end, checking in, reminding me to log things. I had a feeling he wouldn't like this call. He picked up on the third ring, his voice gruff. "Yeah, what is it, Michael?" "It's about the radios, Kevin," I said, trying to keep my voice even, trying to sound professional, and not like I was about to jump out of my skin. The whispers. They're getting louder. And I just heard something really clear, a phrase. There was a pause on the other end, then a tired sigh. "Michael, we've been over this," Kevin said, his voice slow and heavy. "It's old equipment. This place is ancient. Signal interference. It happens." "No, this was different," I insisted, my voice rising a bit. It was clear, a voice. It said, "Find us." He laughed then, a short, dry chuckle that held no humor. "Find who, Michael? The ghosts of Fort Monroe. Look, I get it. It's a lonely gig out there. Empty base, old radios. It can get to you." "It's not getting to me," I said, heat rising in my face. "It's real. The whispers are on my handheld now, too." "You know this base is officially closed, right?" Kevin went on, ignoring what I'd said. "Nobody else should be there. No other units, no other signals. It's probably just some crossover from a local ham radio or something. Or maybe you're picking up a military frequency from Norfolk. Happens all the time." "This doesn't sound like a ham radio," I muttered, looking at the silent barracks. "It sounds distressed." "Look, Michael, I've worked here for years. You're new," he said, his tone dismissive. "I've heard all the stories. Old equipment, a bit of paranoia in the quiet. It's just part of the job. Just log your perimeter checks, keep an eye on the screens, and enjoy the easy money. But just try to get some sleep when you get home, okay?" He cut me off, his voice firm. "You're just tired. Nothing's gonna be out there. Fort Monroe is closed. No one's there but you." He hung up before I could say anything else. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen. Dismissed. That's what I felt. Like he thought I was imagining things, that I was some rookie getting spooked by shadows. It made me feel stupid for even calling, but at the same time, it made me angry. He wasn't out here listening. He wasn't hearing "Find us" echoing in a voice that sounded like it was right next to me. I put the phone down on the passenger seat, my hand shaking a bit. The whispers on the handheld radio continued, a faint, constant reminder that I wasn't crazy. Or maybe I was, and they were feeding into it. I didn't know what to think anymore. The base felt even bigger now, even more empty. Before, it was just quiet. Now, the quiet felt like it was holding a secret. I knew I needed to keep going with my rounds, but the idea of going back to the security office, with that big radio constantly humming with the whispers, made me feel uneasy. I just wanted to be away from it, away from the confinement of that small, silent room. So, I changed my plan. I decided to do longer, more frequent rounds, extending my patrols into areas I usually just drove past quickly. I drove down forgotten access roads, past crumbling concrete structures, and through overgrown sections of the base. I told myself it was just being thorough, doing a better job. But honestly, I just wanted to keep moving, hoping to escape the disembodied voices. It didn't work. No matter where I went, the whispers followed me on my handheld radio. The hum was constant, a low, unnerving sound that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. Every shadow looked like a lurking figure. Every creak and rustle sounded like something moving in the darkness. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, checking the dark road behind me, even though I knew the only vehicle out here was my own. It wasn't just paranoia, I told myself. It was caution. But a part of me knew it was something more, a creeping fear that was starting to settle deep in my stomach. The base was closed, sure, but it didn't feel empty. Not anymore. I kept driving, the whispers on my handheld radio still a constant, creepy hum, even after Kevin had hung up on me. His dismissal just replayed in my head, making everything feel even more absurd. He thought I was tired, imagining things, but I knew what I'd heard. Find us. Those words were sticking with me, a hook in my brain. The base still felt enormous, swallowing up my truck. Its silence no longer just quiet, but loaded with some kind of unspoken weight. I finished my rounds on autopilot after that, just going through the motions. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. Every rustle of dry leaves sounded like someone moving just out of sight. I kept checking my rearview mirror, even though the road behind me was always empty. The whispers on my handheld didn't let up. A low, persistent buzz that was driving me a little crazy. I ended up cranking the truck's radio as loud as it would go, anything to try and drown them out, even though it barely helped. Pop music mixed with ghostly murmurs wasn't exactly a calming soundtrack. When my shift finally ended and I pulled my truck out of the main gate, the sun was just starting to lighten the sky. The chill from the base, that weird cold that settled in your bones, seemed to follow me all the way home to my small apartment in Newport News. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those whispers, saw the dark windows of the barracks, and felt that unsettling quiet. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the entire night. Kevin's voice, dismissing me, was still ringing in my ears. He wrote it off as old equipment, my imagination, but it didn't feel like a glitch. It felt like a plea. The next day, or what passed for day in my messed up schedule, I couldn't shake it. My apartment felt too small, too quiet. The normal sounds of the city outside, distant traffic, neighbors moving around seemed muted, far away. The base, with its empty buildings and haunting whispers, felt more real than anything else. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Kevin might have brushed me off, but I couldn't brush myself off. I needed answers. So I started digging. I pulled out my laptop, the screen a stark contrast to the dim light in my living room, and just started searching. Fort Monroe history, abandoned military base Virginia, unexplained occurrences Fort Monroe. Anything that came to mind, I typed it in. I spent hours clicking through old government archives, most of them public records, some surprisingly detailed. I found historical societies and online forums dedicated to the base, filled with theories and half-remembered stories. It was a slow process, wading through pages of general information about its construction, its role in different wars, and its eventual decommissioning. Most of it was just dry facts, dates, and names of commanding officers. But then I found something. It was buried deep in a digitized archive of local newspaper articles, a small blurb from decades ago. The headline was vague, something about a training exercise gone wrong. It talked about a communications malfunction and hinted at multiple casualties. The details were really scarce, almost deliberately so. It seemed like the kind of thing they didn't want people asking too many questions about. I kept digging, cross-referencing dates, searching for keywords like training facility, accident, communications unit. It took a long time, stretching into the late afternoon. I had to squint at some of the older articles. The digital scans faded and grainy, but piece by piece, a picture started to form. It was a training accident, decades in the past, in a specific facility on the base. A simulated fire had gone terribly wrong. A specialized communication unit, one that had been deemed top secret, was involved. The malfunction they mentioned earlier had apparently cut off all contact between the unit and the outside. In the chaos, with the simulated fire turning real, people had been lost. The articles never gave exact numbers, just grim mentions of significant losses and unfortunate circumstances. The whole thing was hushed up pretty quickly after it happened, chalked up to an unforeseeable incident, and then pretty much erased from the public record. My eyes kept going back to communications malfunction and specialized communication unit. It clicked into place. The whispers, the lost signals. It made a weird kind of awful sense. What if those voices, those disembodied murmurs I'd been hearing, were somehow linked to that unit? What if it wasn't just interference, but some kind of residual signal, a loop of those lost communications from that terrible night? It sounded crazy, even to me, but it felt more real than Kevin's explanation of old equipment and paranoia. The voices weren't just random static. They had a source, a reason. Find us. Those words kept playing in my head, and now they carried a different weight. They weren't just spooky. They were desperate. The tension in my gut tightened. Before, it was just an uneasy feeling, a creepy job in a lonely place. Now, I knew what I was possibly dealing with, a forgotten tragedy. Voices trapped in some kind of endless broadcast, begging for help. It was a heavy thought, a really heavy thought. I didn't feel scared anymore, not exactly. It was more like a strong pull, a need to understand, to maybe even help, if that was even possible. I scrolled back through the articles, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the training accident. They never gave a precise address, just vague references to the training facility near the old firing range. I knew that area. I had driven past it countless times on my rounds. I had even slowed down there a few nights ago, right when the whispers had gotten louder, and I heard "Find us." It all connected, a sickeningly neat puzzle. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark. The room felt even darker, reflecting the heavy thoughts in my head. I didn't want to just sit around and wait for my next shift to start. I wanted to be there now. I wanted to see that training facility, to find out what was really going on. My mind started working on a plan, how I could investigate the area without drawing attention. Kevin clearly wasn't going to help. he probably wouldn't even believe me if I tried to explain what I'd found. This was on me. I realized I needed more than just perimeter checks and screen watching. I needed to specifically find the source, the place where that unit had been during the accident. I decided that during my next shift, I would extend my patrols to include a thorough check of the training facility, going beyond just a quick drive-by. I needed to go inside to see if there was anything left of that communications unit, anything that could be making those sounds. I didn't know what I would find or what I was even looking for, but I knew I had to go. I couldn't just sit there, staring at the walls of my apartment, not after what I'd found. My mind had latched onto the details about that old training accident, the specialized communication unit, and the words, "Find us." Kevin's dismissive attitude just fueled a fire in me, a need to prove I wasn't just some tired rookie freaked out by an empty base. The hours crawled by, every ticking second of my off shift feeling like an eternity. I had a clear goal in my head now, a direct mission. I needed to go back. The next night, I was back in the truck, the familiar rumble of the old engine doing little to calm the tense knot in my stomach. I'd swapped out my usual route for a more direct path to the training facility. I wanted to get there before the base really settled into its midnight lull. But I also wanted it to be late enough that absolutely no one, not even other phantom security guards, would be around. I figured around 3 a.m. was the sweet spot. It was late enough that anything moving would be truly out of place, but still early enough in my shift that I wouldn't be completely drained. The air was still and cold, cutting through the thin jacket I wore. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, the worn plastic digging into my palms. The truck's headlights cut through the gloom, painting sickly yellow streaks across the overgrown paths. Every bump in the road made the old vehicle shake and groan, a sound I usually ignored, but tonight it just added to the jittery feeling. My handheld radio was humming a constant, low buzz. It was already louder than it had been a few nights before, a swirling kind of sound that had taken on a more desperate tone. It wasn't just static anymore. It was a chorus of faint, distressed voices, just below the surface of audibility. It felt like they were talking right into my ear, whispering secrets only I could hear. I kept the volume low, though. I didn't want to accidentally alert anyone to my presence, even if I was pretty sure I was the only person on the whole expansive base. I drove past the main section of the training facility, an open area with scattered concrete barriers and old target stands. This was the place the articles had mentioned, the general vicinity of the accident. I knew the specific location, the one where the specialized communications unit had been, was a bit deeper in, tucked away from the more visible areas. It was near the old firing range, but off to the side, almost hidden by a cluster of overgrown trees. I usually just did a quick pass, barely glancing at it. I had intentionally avoided it these last few nights, even with my extended patrols, because something deep down told me I wasn't ready to face whatever was really going on there. Tonight, though, I had to. It It felt like I was being pulled to it now. The tires crunched on loose gravel as I turned off the main access road, heading down a narrower, barely maintained path. The branches of the trees brushed against the truck's side, scraping with a sound like long, bony fingers. The path was dark, even with my headlights, the trees forming a dense overhead cover that blocked out the faint moonlight. As I got closer to the decaying bunker, the handheld radio in my jacket pocket practically vibrated against my chest. The whispers surged, no longer just a hum, but an almost suffocating wave of sound. It was like I had walked right into the middle of a massive crowd, everyone speaking at once, their voices a mournful, pleading murmur. And then, cutting through the noise, clearer than anything else I'd heard since Find Us, a new phrase emerged, disconnected but distinct. "Help us find the way." The words echoed in my ears, chilling me to the bone. It was different from Find Us. Those words felt like a general plea. These new words, "help us find the way," felt more specific, almost directional. Like they were lost, literally, and needed me to point them somewhere. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my fingers aching. This wasn't some ham radio operator. This wasn't military signal crossover. This was directly connected to the tragedy I'd read about. These were the voices of the people who'd been lost, still asking for help after all these years. I parked the truck a little ways back from the bunker, cutting the engine. The sudden silence, save for the hum of the handheld radio, was unnerving. I pulled out my sturdy flashlight from the glove compartment, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. The bunker entrance looked like a gaping mouth, its concrete teeth broken and chipped. It was a low, squat concrete structure, mostly covered in vines and moss, built right into the side of a small, overgrown hill. I hadn't realized how isolated it was until I was standing right in front of it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was definitely colder, too, a raw, deep cold that even penetrated my jacket. I stepped out of the truck, the ground under my boots feeling strangely soft, almost spongy. The handheld radio in my hand was humming so loud now, it felt like it might shake apart. The whispers were an overwhelming chorus, right there around me. I walked toward the bunker entrance, my flashlight beam jumping ahead, revealing a dark, cramped space. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, catching the light. The air inside felt thick, stagnant, like it hadn't moved in decades. I kept my handheld radio raised, pointed into the darkness, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The sound was just their asterisk. As I stepped inside, the whispers intensified. It was like a physical sensation, a heavy weight pressing in from all sides. I swept the flashlight beam around the interior. It was mostly empty, just cracked concrete walls and a floor covered in loose debris. There were rusted metal conduits running along the ceiling, some dangling down like broken limbs. In the far corner, half hidden by a collapsed section of ceiling, was an old, heavily damaged radio console. It was unlike anything I'd seen in the security office or even in the online archives. This one looked older, more specialized, with a tangled mess of wires and strange, outdated dials. It looked like it had been through an explosion or a fire. As my flashlight beam hit the console, the whispers around me surged a final time, deafening in their urgency. It really did sound like they were right behind me, a cacophony of desperate pleas swirling around my head. I felt a cold dread spread through me, a chilling realization that settled deep in my bones. The source wasn't just the overall base or some random electrical interference. The source was right here, in this dark, cramped bunker, emanating directly from that damaged console. I wasn't just hearing a residual signal from the past. I was in the very heart of it. I carefully approached the damaged radio console inside the bunker. The air around it felt heavy and charged, like right before a big storm. There was a faint, pulsing light coming from a small, unmarked data chip. It was wedged into a port on the side of the console, almost hidden by all the tangled wires and bent metal. I hadn't noticed it at first, with everything else going on. But now that my flashlight beam was on it, it stuck out. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the chip. Some part of me screamed to just leave it alone, to back away from whatever this was. But the whispers had gotten so loud, so desperate. And the words, "Help us find the way," kept replaying in my mind. The curiosity was too strong, a dull ache in my chest that needed an answer. I had to know what was on that chip. My fingers, a little shaky, reached out and carefully pulled the chip free from the console. It slid out with a faint asterisk click asterisk, surprisingly easy considering how old and busted everything else looked. As soon as it was out, the immediate area around me went silent. The overwhelming chorus of whispers, which had been deafening just moments before, stopped abruptly. It was replaced by a lingering, eerie quiet, like the air itself had just taken a massive, shuddering breath, and then slowly let it all out. I held my handheld radio up to my ear, my thumb fumbling for the volume dial. Nothing, just a soft, clean static. Not the swirling, desperate murmurs I'd been hearing for nights. Not the faint, distressed voices that had been talking right into my ear. Just plain, boring static. The silence was almost scarier than the noise had been. It felt wrong, like hitting a dead spot in a conversation where everyone suddenly stops talking and just stares. The chip, small and unassuming, felt oddly warm in my hand. It was an old model, not like any data chip I'd seen modern militaries use, or even the ones I used for daily tasks on my laptop. It looked like something from a completely different era, thicker, and with a different connector. But the warmth, that was weird. It wasn't hot, just a subtle, persistent warmth, like it had a life of its own. I stared at the chip, turning it over in my fingers. What exactly was this thing? A recording device? A storage unit for old communications? Or something else entirely? Something that kept the whispers trapped, looping them endlessly. The idea that this tiny piece of outdated tech held the key to everything made a strange kind of sense. The whispers had stopped right after I pulled it. It seemed like the connection was too direct to be a coincidence. I knew this chip held the truth. It had to. It was the only thing that made sense. Those voices, those words, "Help us find the way," they had come from here. And now, Here was this chip, pulsing faintly, warm in my palm, and the silence was absolute. It felt like I had reached into a wound and pulled out the bullet. The thought of what could be on it made my stomach tighten. The articles I'd read talked about a communications malfunction, significant losses. What if this chip was a direct recording of the night of the accident? What if it held the last moments of those people, caught in the chaos and the simulated fire that went real? It was a heavy thought, a really heavy thought that settled deep in my chest. I knew I couldn't examine it here. The bunker was too dark, too oppressive, and I was still technically on shift, even if I was miles off my regular patrol route. Plus, I didn't have the right equipment to even look at it. This wasn't some regular USB. It needed specialized gear, something that could read outdated military tech. I had to take it somewhere safe, somewhere I could be alone and figure out what to do with it. My apartment was the obvious choice. It was small, but it was private, and I could get online, research the chip, and find out what kind of adapter it needed. The idea of getting the chip home felt like a huge task, like moving a fragile, ancient artifact. I didn't want to damage it, didn't want to lose whatever information it held. I turned the chip over again in my hand, thinking about how different it looked from the smooth, sleek data chips I used every day. This one was chunkier, with a kind of retro-futuristic vibe, like something out of an old sci-fi movie. One side of it had what looked like minor burn marks, but barely any visible damage that would suggest it was impacted by an explosion or fire. I knew this wasn't just some old, abandoned piece of tech anymore. This was a piece of a mystery, a tangible link to a forgotten tragedy. I had to treat it with care. It wasn't just a data chip, it was evidence, a piece of a puzzle that had haunted this base, and me for days, maybe even for decades. I tucked the chip carefully into the inner pocket of my jacket, zipping it up for extra security. My hands felt a little clumsy, a mix of adrenaline and the lingering cold in the bunker. I swept my flashlight beam around the empty space one last time. Without the whispers, the bunker felt just like an old, quiet, abandoned structure. The sense of dread that had been so strong earlier was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. A cold, deep cold still permeated everything, a reminder that it wasn't a comforting kind of calm. I turned and walked out of the bunker, my boots crunching on the loose debris on the floor. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the trees outside, even though it was still dark. The air felt lighter, almost breathable, compared to the heavy, stagnant feeling inside. The cold here still cut deep, but it didn't feel as oppressive as it had been just moments before. I walked back to my truck, my steps a little faster now, the ground no longer feeling spongy beneath my boots. The branches still scraped against the truck's side as I rounded the bend, but the sound didn't feel as foreboding as it had on the way in. The feeling of being watched was gone too, just the silence and the constant hum of my handheld radio, now back to regular, boring static. Getting back in the truck, I started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the quiet, a welcome sound after the absolute silence of the bunker. I didn't want to waste time on my return trip. I needed to get this chip somewhere secure, somewhere I could start analyzing it. The need to understand what was on it was a sharp, insistent thing, overriding any lingering fear. I drove out of the narrow, overgrown path, the truck's headlights cutting through the dense trees. As I turned onto the main access road, the familiar outlines of the training facility appeared in the distance. The concrete barriers and target stands looked normal again, just abandoned structures, nothing more. The base felt like itself once more, a quiet, forgotten place. The eerie stillness of the bunker, with its abrupt silence, lingered in my mind. I knew I still had hours left on my shift. I couldn't just bail. I drove back to the main security office, the road feeling longer and more desolate than usual. I had to act normal when I got there, fill out my patrol logs, maybe even chat with Kevin if he happened to call. I had to pretend everything was business as usual, even though my pocket held a piece of forgotten history, a silent echo of a haunting past. I pulled into the parking lot of the security office. The harsh yellow glow of the overhead lights a jarring contrast to the darkness of the base. My truck rolled to a stop. I shut off the engine. The quiet hum of the handheld radio in my pocket was the only sound now, just static, peaceful, almost normal static. I knew my normal shift duties felt trivial now, but I had to go through the motions. I couldn't let anyone know what I'd found, not yet. This was my secret, my burden. The chip felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the truth I now held. I had to get it home. I had to understand what it contained. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, the chip practically burning a hole in my jacket pocket. My shift had felt endless, a blur of routine tasks and forced normalcy, while my mind replayed the sound of those whispers and the eerie silence that followed. I couldn't wait to get inside, away from the quiet hum of the handheld radio and the oppressive feeling of holding onto such a secret. My apartment in Newport News was small, just big enough for me and my thoughts, which lately felt more like a crowd. I kicked off my boots by the door, barely bothering to turn on the main lights, just the soft glow of my laptop screen illuminating the cramped living room. I needed to focus, to figure out what to do with this thing. The first step was obvious: identify the chip. I spent hours online, hunched over my laptop, searching for outdated military data chips and specialized communication unit connectors. The internet was a rabbit hole of forums, obscure military surplus sites, and digitized historical documents. Most of it was useless. Every few minutes, I'd pull the chip out, turning it over in my fingers, staring at the strange port. The warm glow, though faint, seemed to draw me in. Hours blurred, coffee mugs piled up on my desk. My eyes started to ache. Finally, buried deep in an old Signal Corps forum, I found a grainy diagram of a communication unit from the late 70s. And there it was, a match. The diagram showed a specific, highly specialized data port designed for a custom encryption chip, used only by a handful of experimental units. The connector on my chip was identical. The diagram called it a Type 7 experimental data key. Finding an adapter was a whole other problem. The forum members talked about them like they were mythological creatures. Nobody had one. They were too old, too rare. Most people assumed the few that existed were long scrapped, but one comment, buried under dozens of others, mentioned a guy, a specialist in Richmond who collected and repaired obsolete military tech. He had a reputation for finding anything, no matter how obscure. He was apparently nicknamed the Connector King. It sounded crazy, but I was desperate. The drive to Richmond felt like an eternity. The specialist's shop was tucked away in a dusty industrial park, smelling of ozone, old metal, and something vaguely like burnt plastic. A wiry man with thick glasses and grease stains on his work coat, looked at the chip for a long moment, turning it over with surprising gentleness. Type 7, he said, almost to himself. Haven't seen one of these in 30 years. You're lucky. I just happen to have an adapter. Custom built one back in the day for a collector. Never thought I'd use it again. It cost me a week's pay, but it was worth it. I practically ran back to my truck, the adapter clutched in my hand like a treasure. My apartment, when I finally got back, felt like a command center. I plugged the adapter into my laptop, a bulky, archaic contraption that looked completely alien next to my sleek, modern machine. Then, with a deep breath, I slid the Type 7 chip into the adapter slot. A soft, familiar warmth spread from the chip through the adapter and into my laptop's cold metal casing. The laptop screen flickered. A new drive icon appeared. It was labeled Unit 73 COM. I clicked on it. A folder opened, filled with dozens of audio files. They were all encrypted, of course, and most looked heavily corrupted. I tried opening the first one. It was just a blast of static, a harsh, grating sound that made my teeth ache. The next one was the same, and the next. My shoulders sagged. All this for nothing. I kept trying, though, hour after hour, pulling up every audio forensics tool I could find online. I tried decryption software, noise reduction filters, frequency modulators. Most of it was useless without the original encryption key, which obviously wasn't anywhere to be found. The sun was a dull glow through my blinds by the time I finally hit on something. A specific open source filter that specialized in reconstructing damaged waveforms from analog sources. It was a long shot. I selected the largest file, the one that looked like it contained the most data, and ran the filter. The progress bar crawled, painfully slow. I watched it, my eyes burning, my stomach a tight knot of anticipation. When it finally finished, a new file appeared, labeled CLEANED Audio 001 WAV. I clicked play. At first, it was still mostly static, a low, persistent hiss that reminded me of the handheld radio in the bunker. But then, underneath it, faint at first, I heard it. Voices. Distant, muffled, but clearly human. Interference. We're losing comms. A male voice yelled, strained. Another voice, female, broke through. Unit 73, do you copy? What's your position? The male voice again, closer this time, filled with panic. Can't pinpoint, we're disoriented. Where are we? The static surged, almost drowning him out. Another voice, fainter, desperate. The simulation, it's real. We're caught and find us. A burst of what sounded like chaotic screaming, then a loud, sickening crackle. The male voice came back, thinner, more desperate. "We can't find the way. We're lost. Help us, please find the way." Then, just fading static. The clip ended. I sat there, frozen, the sound of my own breathing loud in the sudden silence of my apartment. It wasn't supernatural. Not ghosts, not some paranormal activity. It was a broadcast. A dying broadcast, looping endlessly on a damaged, ungrounded device, echoing through the empty spaces of the base because the energy, the desperate pleas, couldn't dissipate. The words, "Find us," and "Help us find the way," weren't cryptic messages from the beyond. They were the final, frantic words of people caught in a nightmare, lost and disoriented, searching for rescue. The specialized communications unit, the training accident, the casualties, it all flooded my mind. The chip wasn't transmitting a signal. It was asterisk playing asterisk 1 over and over, like an old, broken record. The damage from the incident, the exposure to the elements in that bunker, had somehow caused it to trap and loop that final moment, sending out those desperate voices as faint, almost undetectable whispers. Those whispers I'd been hearing, those awful pleas, they were the last thoughts of the men and women who had been lost in that training accident, trapped not in some spectral realm, but in a continuous, faint broadcast, looping their final words for decades. A deep, hollow sadness settled over me. It wasn't a terrifying realization, but a heartbreaking one. I wasn't haunted by spirits. I was listening to an echo of human suffering, a plea for help that had gone unanswered for too long. The chip wasn't a source of dread, but a piece of evidence, a tangible link to a tragedy that had been covered up, reduced to a few vague lines in a dusty archive. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. The quiet hum of my handheld radio, left on low volume, provided a quiet background noise. It was just static, clean, normal static. The whispers were gone, silenced by the removal of the chip that had created them. The truth felt heavy, not just in my hands, but in my chest. I finally understood everything. The mystery was gone. The haunting was over. And in its place was a profound sadness for those lost, their last moments forever etched onto a forgotten data chip, finally heard after all these years.